Welcome to Despicable Me Deep Dive Podcast. Today on the show, the depopulation agenda, global slaughter of the innocent.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're really going deep today into a source text that lays out an incredibly intense view of the world. Our mission in this deep dive, as always, is to simply unpack what this source says, its core claims, the arguments it makes, and the specific examples or evidence it presents to support those claims. We're sticking strictly to the material in this text.
That's right. And this particular source, it doesn't see current global events as a series of unfortunate coincidences or even just the result of incompetence or greed. It presents a picture where nearly everything happening is deliberate, driven by what the author actually characterizes as a malignant contempt. The source argues there's a calculated global plan unfolding with what it sees as profound and, frankly, terrifying implications for everyone. Okay, let's unpack the foundational assertion of this source then, because it's pretty stark. It really sets the stage for everything else. The text states, quite directly, there is a plan to reduce the world's population by 9/10. I mean, when you hear that, reducing the population by 90%, that's a massive claim right at the outset, isn't it?
It is, and according to the source, this isn't some side effect or, an unintended consequence. No, It's presented as the central driving force behind almost everything that is happening in the world today. The author is very firm in pushing back against more conventional explanations, saying explicitly that events are not happening by accident or coincidence.
Right. So if the source rejects coincidence and it rejects common explanations like incompetence, greed, or stupidity, what does it claim is driving all this?
Well, the source asserts these events are part of a deliberate, high-level conspiracy. It claims the primary aim of this alleged plan is twofold. Firstly, to gain control of the world, and secondly, to set up a world government. So, control and global governance. They're presented as the ultimate objectives behind everything that's happening, according to this text.
And what's the alleged pathway the source sees leading to these goals? How do they plan to get there, according to this text?
The source paints a specific trajectory. It claims this plan intends to lead us, quote, via the horrors of net zero into the wilderness of the Great Reset.
Okay.
Now, terms like net zero, you often hear them referring to environmental policies, right, aimed at reducing carbon emissions. And Great Reset is a term that, it gained prominence in discussions about global economic recovery and social change. But the source frames these concepts not as conventional policies or discussions, but as deliberate steps within this alleged conspiracy, describing them using highly negative terms like horrors and wilderness. It's quite loaded language.
Yeah, it really is. And alongside these sort of grand goals of control and world government, the source also points to a very clear financial motive as a key driver, doesn't it?
Yes, it absolutely does. It highlights what it calls a subsidiary aim, which is to save money by dramatically cutting the amount of money spent on pensions, benefits, welfare, and medical care. So according to the source, there's a cold economic calculation underpinning this massive alleged plan. It's about saving money on supporting people, depopulation and control serving that end.
The language the source uses to describe the current state of the world as a result of this alleged plan is incredibly powerful and disturbing. It describes people as victims and prisoners in a world allegedly prepared with malignant contempt. It goes as far as to call the current situation our own killing fields and explicitly names it the slaughter of the innocent. The source presents this not as some future threat, but as a reality that is happening right now.
Okay, so moving on from that central claim, the depopulation plan, the control, the saving money, the source then pivots. It starts presenting what it views as concrete evidence for this widespread conspiracy. It argues that various global events, things which might seem disparate on the surface, are actually interconnected pieces of this larger calculated plan.
Right. And one of the major areas the source focuses on is environmental and economic policies. It claims these aren't about their stated goals at all.
Absolutely not, according to this text. The source directly asserts that the global warming myth itself is part of this alleged plan. It frames climate concerns not as legitimate environmental issues, but as, fabricated elements of the conspiracy.
So a myth. And stemming from that, what specific policy does the source point to as being a tool of this alleged plan?
It focuses intently on the absurd and unnecessary net zero campaign as a deliberate action that's part of this plan. The source argues that these campaigns, despite their stated environmental aims, are intentionally designed to cause energy prices to soar. The author sees this as a calculated move, not an accidental side effect of, green policies.
And according to the source, what is the grim consequence of these soaring energy prices allegedly caused by the net zero push?
The source makes a very, very serious claim here, stating that as a direct result of people being unable to afford heating due to these policies, millions die of cold. It paints a picture of a deliberate policy leading directly to mass mortality.
Wow. The author even interjects a sort of personal note here, wishing global warming were real just for some sunshine, which seems to emphasize their view that it's entirely made up and the policies are causing suffering for no legitimate reason.
Yeah, it's a stark comment. Another key area the source claims is being deliberately targeted is global food production and economies. The text unequivocally states that the destruction of farming and economies around the world is part of this depopulation plan. It views disruptions to agriculture not as economic challenges or natural events, but as intentional acts of sabotage within the conspiracy.
And the source provides a very specific, concrete example from the UK to illustrate this point about the alleged deliberate destruction of farming, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It claims that farmers in the UK are being paid a specific sum, £250 per acre, not to cultivate crops for food, but to use their land to grow nettles, brambles, and a few wildflowers. This practice, often referred to as rewilding, is presented by the source not as an environmental initiative at all, but as a component of the alleged plan.
And according to the source, what is the supposed malicious aim behind this rewilding practice and the broader attack on farming? Why do this?
The text is clear on this. It claims the aim is to push up food prices and increase the number of people dying of hunger. So the source connects this alleged destruction of farming directly to causing starvation on a large scale.
Right. And the source then links this specific example back to observable global trends, stating that food prices around the world have soared. It presents this as evidence supporting its claim that farming is being deliberately undermined.
And it makes a very significant claim about the human cost, stating that countless millions in Africa have already died from hunger. Presenting this as a direct consequence of the policies it alleges are aimed at destroying farming and increasing food prices. It's important to note that the source text itself doesn't provide specific data or verification for this figure within the material provided to us, but it makes the claim forcefully as evidence of the plan's impact.
Okay, so environmental policies framed as a myth leading to death by cold, and the destruction of farming leading to death by hunger. These are presented as two key prongs of the alleged plan. What other broad global events does the source argue are part of this narrative?
Well, the source also includes large-scale population movements and international conflicts in its list of evidence for the conspiracy.
Right. It claims that massive immigration programs are part of the plan. The source text here lists this point, but it doesn't really elaborate in detail, at least in this section, on how facilitating these programs specifically serves the stated goal of depopulation by 9/10 or global control. It's just presented as another item on the list of orchestrated events.
Exactly. The mere existence and scale of these programs are cited by the source as further indicators of the broader conspiracy at work. Similarly, the source claims that wars are spreading and argues that these conflicts are also deliberately part of this alleged plan.
And the source adds a financial detail about these conflicts, claiming that huge amounts of money are being diverted into arms and armed forces, often without good reason. It suggests the spending isn't simply a result of geopolitical tensions, but a calculated move within the framework of the conspiracy.
Right. But while it briefly mentions immigration and wars, the source dedicates significantly more focus, much more detail, to another area. What it presents as perhaps the most direct and brutal manifestation of this alleged depopulation plan.
Yes, because the source then shifts to an extensive discussion of what it claims is the deliberate dismantling of ethical medical care, presenting it as a core element of the conspiracy.
Exactly. This section is a major focus in the source text and is presented with considerable intensity. It makes the explicit claim that the end of medicine is a fundamental part of the plan.
And like the other aspects, the source ties this alleged destruction of medicine back to that economic motive mentioned earlier.
It argues this deliberate shift in healthcare is aimed squarely at saving money on expenses like pensions, benefits, and long-term medical care for the sick and elderly. The source characterizes this specific aspect of the alleged plan, the deliberate harming or ending of lives within the medical system, as truly the slaughter of the innocent. That phrase again.
The source traces a history for this alleged dismantling of caring medicine, claiming it began with a specific program.
It asserts that the starting point for this alleged trend was the Liverpool Care Pathway, or LCP. This was a protocol developed in the UK for end-of-life care.
And how does the source describe the LCP? Not favorably, I imagine.
Not at all. It calls it one of the most shameful and inhumane programs ever introduced in medicine. According to the source's description, the process under the LCP was allegedly chillingly straightforward for certain patients. Those deemed too old by doctors or nurses were literally starved of food and drink. The source also claims they were denied medicines they needed too.
So the source portrays medical professionals under this program doing the exact opposite of providing care.
Yes, it explicitly states they were doing the opposite of caring for patients. The source is unequivocal, characterizing the LCP as legalized murder. It claims that while the LCP was officially ended after criticism, it still continues in practice. But its limitation, from the perspective of this alleged depopulation conspiracy, was that it could only really be applied to the elderly and the very ill. It couldn't easily be applied more broadly, you see.
I see. And so, according to the source, what came next? What widened the scope of this alleged medically assisted killing?
The source claims that then came the introduction of do not resuscitate DNR notices. Now these are standard medical orders, right? Indicating that a patient shouldn't be given CPR if their heart or breathing stops. But the source frames them very differently, calling them death sentences slammed on the medical records of countless millions of patients. Very strong language.
The source does acknowledge what it claims was the initial intention behind DNR, doesn't it? It suggests it started differently.
Yes. It presents the original idea behind DNR notices as being introduced with good intentions, meant to temper scientific advances with a little genuine kindness. The source suggests the original concept was about recognizing when a patient was truly beyond hope, avoiding endlessly trying to revive individuals who were dying and beyond help, simply delaying the inevitable and potentially causing distress. It even speculates that around the world, millions of comatose and brain-dead patients would still be alive today if the principle of DNR had not been quietly introduced, suggesting its initial introduction already had a significant impact, albeit presented here as linked to the principle itself, not necessarily abuse at that stage.
But the source claims that original intention is long gone, that DNR is now being widely abused.
Yeah, far from its alleged original purpose. The source asserts that today do not resuscitate notices are routinely slapped on the medical notes of a vastly wider population group. Ill is patients who are awaiting surgery for entirely curable problems, those simply old, by which they mean they're over 50, or those who are disabled or ill or suffering from mental illness.
That's quite a list. And the source makes the very disturbing claim that this alleged abuse of DNR is extending even to younger people.
Yes, it states emphatically that even young adults and children have been labeled do not resuscitate if a doctor or nurse felt that their lives were in some way worthless. The source's conclusion about this alleged widespread application of DNR is that the medical establishment, as part of the conspiracy, has deliberately and cold-bloodedly taken the caring out of medicine.
And the source claims this alleged decline in caring, this deliberate harming of patients, escalated dramatically during a very specific recent period, one the source frames very critically.
Yes, the text states this trend came to a head during the COVID fraud. That's the term the source uses. According to the source, the medical establishment, driven by the alleged conspiracy, decided during this period that the existing LCP and DNR processes weren't killing people fast enough.
Right. And the source makes an extremely serious and specific accusation about what allegedly happened during the COVID lockdowns in 2020, particularly in care homes.
It claims that during this period, doctors began systematically, deliberately, and cold-bloodedly murdering old people in care homes. The method, according to the source, was the administration of a kill shot injection consisting of midazolam and morphine. Now, midazolam is a sedative, morphine a painkiller, medications often used in end-of-life care to manage symptoms, ensure comfort. But the source alleges here that they were deliberately misused as a kill shot for the purpose of murder. This is the source's explicit claim.
And the source doesn't hedge on its interpretation of this alleged act, does it? Posing a direct question about it.
No, it asks us rhetorically, what else do you call it but murder when patients are deliberately killed to save money? The source sees this alleged action not as a medical decision, but as an act of murder motivated by the financial aim of the conspiracy.
And underlying these claims about medical practices during COVID, the source also forcefully argues that the entire alleged COVID pandemic was a hoax.
Yes, the source presents a very different narrative of the COVID period than the widely accepted one. It claims that the science and the statistics showed that COVID was nothing more than a remarketed annual flu. The source highlights that in 2020, official records showed no official flu, and it argues this was because everyone diagnosed with COVID actually had the flu. It uses the benchmark that up to 600,000 people worldwide can die in an annual flu season as a point of comparison to frame its argument about the alleged scale of COVID deaths being exaggerated.
And the source claims governments actively participated in deceiving the public about the scale of COVID deaths.
Yes, it asserts that governments try to fiddle the figures to show that COVID was killing millions. It wasn't, end quote. The source alleges that people dying from other causes. It gives examples like heart attacks or cancer, accidents in the street, were all put down as COVID victims. It labels this alleged misattribution of deaths as a massive fraud.
So, if the source claims COVID itself wasn't killing millions, what does it claim was causing the excess deaths observed during that period?
According to the source, the additional deaths during the COVID period were primarily a result of the lockdowns, which were never justified, and later what it calls the toxic vaccine. The author claims they warned right at the beginning of 2020 that a vaccine was coming and would be made compulsory, portraying it as part of the planned events.
And tying all of this back to the central conspiracy claim, the source states unequivocally that the mass murder of the elderly was part of the depopulation plan. It sees the alleged actions during COVID as a direct execution of this goal.
It provides further details about the alleged actions of medical professionals, specifically in March and April 2020. It claims doctors said they would simply refuse to see or treat old people, and recounts one anecdote where a GP allegedly told a care home manager that no one over the age of 75 would be admitted to hospital. Cat. The source also claims referrals by general practitioners, family doctors in the UK for cancer, fell by 70% as doctors abandoned their patients and their responsibilities.
And the source explicitly points to the financial outcome of these alleged actions as confirmation of the motive. It circles back to the money.
Yes, it makes the very serious accusation that as the number of pensioners dying increased, government ministers openly boasted of the huge amounts of money that they were saving.
Sure.
The source specifies they were saving on pensions that they didn't have to pay, and they were saving on medical care. This is presented by the source as evidence that the motive for the alleged actions against the elderly was financial, directly linked to the depopulation agenda's aim of saving money on welfare.
The source uses incredibly strong language to describe what it claimed happened to the elderly during 2020. Just visceral terms.
It doesn't hold back, calling it nothing more or less than a form of genocide. The author stresses that during the 2020 lockdowns, thousands of old people were murdered, calling this not hyperbole. It reiterates the claim that these elderly individuals were isolated from their families and friends and then deliberately murdered with kill shots of morphine and of benzodiazepine.
The source claims the official reason given for isolating and allegedly killing the elderly, to keep them out of hospitals for younger COVID patients, was false.
That's right. The source disputes this reason by claiming that doctors and nurses allegedly, quote, had so little to do during the COVID hoax that they spent their time reversing TikTok dance routines while the innocent elderly were being slaughtered. It also claims that specially built hospitals designed to cope with the avalanche of COVID patients were left empty and unused, suggesting there was no capacity crisis justifying keeping the elderly out.
And the source makes a very bold claim about who it sees as responsible for suppressing the truth about this alleged fraud and genocide.
Yes, it accuses specific media organizations such as YouTube and the BBC of suppressing attempts to tell the truth about the deliberate, cold-blooded fraud. The author expresses an extreme view, stating their wish that the staff of which will in due course be tried en masse for genocide, directly linking these media organizations to the alleged mass killing through suppression of information. It's a really intense accusation.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, within this extensive medical section, the source discusses what it presents as the latest and perhaps most globally pervasive stage of the alleged plan, the promotion of euthanasia.
Right. The source claims that euthanasia, global doctor-assisted suicide, mercy killing, or whatever you want to call it, is being promoted globally. The author sees its sudden and global proliferation as a clear indicator that something's planned and bad, directly linking its promotion to the alleged conspiracy rather than, say, evolving societal views or medical ethics.
The source strongly argues that any country introducing euthanasia has fundamentally compromised itself.
Yes, it claims any such country has effectively abandoned any pretense at civilization. And while proponents of euthanasia often talk about rules and regulations and restrictions, to ensure only the terminally ill are accepted, and speak of compassion and kindness, the source is profoundly cynical about these claims. It calls the idea that any government would genuinely act to improve lives sadly laughable, and claims the proponents' intentions are built more on ignorance than kindness, suggesting a fundamental misunderstanding or maybe even willful deception about the nature and consequences of euthanasia.
The source specifically highlights one argument it claims is used by some proponents, which it completely rejects.
It misses the argument that individuals should be allowed to die if they feel they have become a burden on society or their families. The source clearly views this not as a compassionate consideration, but as a chilling signal that the individual is a target of the alleged conspiracy's financial motive, that they're seen as costly.
And the source claims that despite any initial promises of strict rules, these are quickly abandoned once euthanasia is introduced.
Yes, it asserts unequivocally that whenever and wherever euthanasia is introduced, the rules are abandoned or changed. It claims that it's not long before the service is available to a much wider group than initially stated. It lists those who are the anxious, the depressed, the disabled, the unemployed, and the poor. It also claims it will quickly become available to the young and to the old, and it will be available to teenagers who are feeling down.
This is a core part of the source's argument against euthanasia, that its scope will inevitably broaden far beyond terminal illness.
The source even directly links the financial status of citizens to becoming a potential target for euthanasia under this alleged plan.
It makes a stark claim about the UK population, stating that more than half the UK population is officially a burden on the state, meaning they receive more benefits than they pay in tax. The source argues these individuals are therefore the primary target of the government's plan to start the mass slaughter of citizens, viewing them as economically undesirable from the alleged conspiracy's perspective. The source counters the euthanasia argument by bringing up statistics related to suicide attempts.
It states its view that no one promoting euthanasia or suicide by doctor seems to know or care that 9 out of 10 people who attempt suicide but fail subsequently live long, successful lives and regret having tried to kill themselves. The source uses this statistic to argue that even individuals in despair can recover and find value in life, implying that facilitating death prevents potential future well-being.
And it also references a specific study regarding psychiatric issues among those requesting assisted dying in Canada.
Yes, it cites a Canadian study from 2021, noting that the researchers concluded that patients with psychiatric comorbidity comprise a substantial proportion of patients requesting medical assistance in dying. The source presents this finding as support for its view that euthanasia is not remaining limited to the physically terminally ill, but is being sought and potentially granted to those with mental health challenges, which aligns with its claim about the rules being abandoned. It's presenting this study's findings as evidence of the trend it alleges.
So, the source explicitly dismisses the idea that euthanasia, as it's being implemented globally, is just for those at the very end of life, or purely seeking dignity in death.
Absolutely. It states that the initial concept that it will be available only to patients at the very end of the dying process, specifically to be liberated from intractable pain and suffering, allowing them to die in quiet dignity, is definitely not what happens in practice. The source sees this as a false promise used to gain acceptance for the practice.
And the source points to Canada as a specific current example of where it claims the system is being severely abused and has already expanded far beyond terminal illness.
Yes, it urges the listener to look at every country which has introduced euthanasia, look at Canada where people are being murdered because they're jobless and poor and without hope. The source claims people there are being killed not for medical reasons, but for social reasons.
The source makes some very specific and alarming predictions about the future eligibility criteria for euthanasia, again citing Canada as a precedent.
It claims that euthanasia will be available for patients with mental illness in Canada starting in 2027. But it goes even further. It makes shocking claims that children with autism, Asperger's, and ADHD will be quietly euthanized, and alleges that school children who are miserable will be quietly euthanized without their parents' knowledge or consent. These are extremely serious claims presented by the source as the future under the alleged plan.
And consistently with the other alleged elements of the plan, the source repeatedly returns to the financial motive for promoting euthanasia on a global scale. It always comes back to money.
It states emphatically, and it is of course all about money. The source claims the core motivation is not kindness, but simply killing patients isn't about kindness, it's about saving money. It explicitly links this to the well-documented plan to reduce the size of the world's population down to 500 million, claiming that killing the long-term sick saves a lot of money.
The source provides specific recent examples related to veterans to illustrate its claim that euthanasia is being offered for non-terminal, non-compassionate reasons.
Yes, it mentions a Canadian Armed Forces veteran who was injured in Afghanistan, claiming that at least 6 veterans in Canada have been offered euthanasia after asking for help for their injuries or crises. It recounts one specific incident where a veteran who sought help received a letter saying, quote, "If it's too difficult for you to continue living, madam, we can offer you medical assistance in dying," end quote. Another veteran allegedly called a crisis hotline and was offered assisted suicide as a solution to their problems. The source claims this trend is already happening in the UK, citing an example of a 25-year-old veteran in crisis who asked for help and was assisted dying by a doctor. The source presents these as concrete examples of how this system is allegedly being used to eliminate people who are simply struggling or seen as a burden.
And the source ties the money saved through euthanasia programs directly back to other alleged parts of the conspiracy.
It claims a euthanasia program in the UK will save millions for the government and doubtless enable it to spend more money on bullets and bombs to kill more people. The author's harsh summary of modern politics within this framework is that modern politicians save money by killing people and then use the money they've saved to kill more people. It's a brutal cycle presented by the source.
The source argues that providing decent palliative care would be a genuinely kinder and more ethical alternative to euthanasia, but claims this is being deliberately undermined.
It contrasts palliative care, which focuses on comfort and quality of life for seriously ill patients, as being kinder, gentler, and more in keeping with the tradition of healing. It presents the alleged official policy behind promoting euthanasia as the exact opposite. Why cure people or just care for them when you can just kill them instead? That's how the source frames the official policy.
The source firmly asserts that the primary motivation for introducing official death-by-doctor schemes is entirely financial.
Yes. It claims the biggest advantage of the official death-by-doctor scheme will be the billions, which will be saved by cutting the benefits and pensions bills. It views the financial saving as the driving force, overshadowing any claims of compassion.
And despite any initial limited criteria, the source argues that assisted suicide is becoming widely recommended to many different groups, not just the terminally ill.
It claims that, although the process always begins with some caveats, it doesn't take long for doctor-assisted suicide to be freely recommended to the elderly, the mentally ill, the disabled, the poor, and the unemployed. This reinforces the source's argument that the scope expands rapidly.
The source makes a very striking and disturbing prediction about how patients diagnosed with serious illnesses will be treated in the future under this alleged plan.
It claims that once a patient is diagnosed with a serious illness, the first thing that will happen is that they'll be invited to avoid all their problems, save the nation money, and join the waiting list for death. The author predicts there will literally be a waiting list for death under the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. This is presented as the future reality where death is the default option offered.
And the source claims the DNR scheme is already operating in a similar way, using deception to push patients towards death.
Yes, it alleges that doctors and nurses lie to patients and tell them resuscitation is always painful, and that it's better for them to die if they develop an infection, for example. The source sees this as deliberate manipulation. It explicitly states that killing patients or just letting them die is officially part of the medical establishment's response to the global warming myth. The author refers back to their book, The End of Medicine, as explaining precisely how and why doctors are allegedly doing this.
The source also links the alleged lack of adequate pain relief in medical care to the promotion of euthanasia.
It argues that the lack of decent pain relief means that some patients will choose euthanasia because they're frightened of being in pain. The source counters the idea that patients receiving genuine pain relief become addicted, stating that evidence shows they do not become addicted, as some doctors claim.
And the source makes a very specific, quite unusual claim about why some doctors are allegedly refusing to prescribe necessary painkillers.
Yes, this is quite something. It claims some doctors are refusing to prescribe because they, quote, have been wrongly told that global warming comes first and patients' needs come second. The alleged argument is that doctors should stop prescribing because drugs are affecting global warming. The source dismisses this specific belief as patently dangerous cultist nonsense, but argues that whether believed or used as an excuse, the lack of painkillers means without painkillers, more people will opt for the government-approved euthanasia option.
The source also pushes back strongly on the common perception that euthanasia is a quick and painless way to die.
It states directly, it isn't painless and it isn't fast. It even makes the claim that patients can wake up after being given a lethal dose, suggesting the process is not as controlled or humane as proponents might claim.
And the source links the worsening of general medical care and increasing waiting list to a deliberate effort to increase the demand for euthanasia programs.
It argues that the demand for euthanasia will increase as medical care becomes worse and waiting lists get longer, noting that both are happening very rapidly. The source claims millions of patients in the UK will now die before they receive the treatment they need due to these worsening conditions. It then poses a rhetorical question, suggesting the deliberate worsening of care might be a tactic. Is this being done deliberately to push them into choosing euthanasia?
The source further argues that the suffering of dying patients is intentionally exaggerated by proponents to promote death by doctor.
It claims the idea of patients dying in agony is grossly exaggerated for the purpose of promoting death by doctor. The source asserts that no one need ever be in intractable pain, that pain control is or should be available, and that proper pain management can free patients and often give them more life. It reiterates that patients are only in unbearable pain if their pain control isn't managed properly, and again dismisses the fear of addiction for genuine pain patients as a nonsense.
The source places the blame for this alleged reduction in prescribing and focus on global warming beliefs onto a specific group within the medical establishment.
It claims there is a clique of cultists within the medical establishment who mistakenly believe that prescribing drugs contributes to global warming, and that this group have encouraged doctors to cut back on their prescribing, leading to patient suffering.
And the source claims governments everywhere are actively working to destroy palliative care services.
It states unequivocally, governments everywhere are deliberately and cold-bloodedly destroying palliative care. The source attributes hospice closures to government policies and tax rules, arguing they can't afford to stay open under these conditions.
And according to the source, this leaves sick and dying patients with very limited options, pushing them towards euthanasia.
Exactly. The source claims that without hospices, patients are left with nowhere to go except to opt for euthanasia. That's the plan. The strategy, according to the source, is to close the hospices and push the sick, the depressed, and the elderly into one of the state's death rooms.
The source sees the withdrawal of aid and support for palliative care as a deliberate tactic to achieve this.
Yes, it argues that as palliative care becomes difficult to find and governments are withdrawing aid, the result, as governments know, will be a greater demand for euthanasia. The source views this as a planned outcome, not an unfortunate side effect.
The source again challenges anyone considering euthanasia, urging them to research the reality of the process.
It tells anyone who thinks it's painless to do a little research because it isn't.
The source also strongly rejects the medical concept of knowing definitively when someone is terminally ill, arguing against it as a basis for euthanasia.
It claims proponents say it's for terminal illness, but the source author, drawing on their own experience as a GP, states it's impossible to know when a patient is terminally ill. They recount their own experience with 2 patients diagnosed terminal who lived for more than a decade after they'd been abandoned by hospitals, attributing their extended lives to having strong reasons for staying alive. They suggest older GPs have similar stories.
The source argues that doctors saying, "you're going to die," really means something else entirely.
It claims that when the doctors use the words "you're going to die," what they really mean is, we don't know what else to do. We have no treatment left that we can use. The source insists it's impossible to know when a patient is terminally ill, and doctors saying there's nothing more they could do don't mean that the patient is going to die. They mean they don't know what else to do.
The source is particularly critical of doctors making predictions about how long a patient has to live.
It states, no doctor can possibly say to a patient, you've got 6 months to live. No one should make predictions like that. The author claims to have known patients live for many years after such predictions and argues that when doctors guess about survival time, it's as likely to be wrong as right. They view such predictions as unprofessional and potentially harmful.
The source even uses a strong comparison to highlight the negative impact of doctors' predictions, particularly regarding terminal illness.
It discusses what it calls a negative placebo effect from doctors, particularly the ones in white coats, making negative predictions. It argues there isn't much difference between a doctor in a white coat and a voodoo witch doctor dressed in feathers, suggesting the doctor's negative prediction can have a similar detrimental effect on the patient's outcome. It's a provocative comparison.
It certainly is. The source sees the simultaneous reduction of medical care and the aggressive promotion of euthanasia as undeniable evidence of the plan.
It calls it no coincidence that medical care is being dramatically reduced at the same time as euthanasia is being promoted. The source views this as a deliberate, coordinated effort.
The source provides more specific examples of medical treatments allegedly being stopped or avoided due to this belief in the global warming myth among some doctors.
It claims asthma patients are being told that the treatment they've used for years must be stopped because it affects global warming. It also claims the incidence of sepsis is soaring as doctors refuse to prescribe antibiotics because once again they've been convinced that antibiotics will make global warming worse. The source states that doctors, quote, have been told to stop investigating, diagnosing, and treating illness because they must put the myth of global warming above the interests of real patients.
The source expresses confusion about why doctors would believe these claims, but insists it's happening and is dangerous.
It calls this belief dangerous nonsense and a mystery, saying it doesn't understand why doctors would accept it, but maintains that it's happening. The author promotes their book, The End of Medicine, as explaining precisely why and how doctors are deliberately killing their patients. And another book, A Big Kill, available free on their website for what they call the truth about euthanasia.
And the source even makes a striking historical comparison that it feels highlights the severity of the current alleged situation regarding euthanasia.
It mentions that the Nazis ran a euthanasia program for a while, and after a short period, Adolf Hitler abandoned it because he considered it to be morally indefensible. The source presents this historical point to imply that the current global promotion and alleged implementation of euthanasia is even more morally questionable, claiming it makes the current global plan worse than Nazi policy.
Right, so pulling together this extensive section on medicine, the source is arguing that the healthcare system is being deliberately corrupted, even weaponized, moving away from healing and towards actively eliminating vulnerable populations, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, even children through practices like LCP, systematic DNR abuse, alleged murder during COVID using specific drugs, and now the global promotion of euthanasia.
Exactly. And according to the source, this is all driven by financial savings as part of the broader depopulation goal. It presents detailed claims, anecdotes as evidence for this, while portraying the widely accepted narrative of COVID as, well, what it calls a hoax.
The source wraps up its argument by restating its central claim and drawing a very direct implication for you, the listener.
Yes, it concludes by stating flatly, today the global depopulation plan is real and you are the target. It characterizes the present time in very strong terms, calling them strange and frightening times. The source leaves no room for ambiguity about its view of the listener's place in this alleged scenario.
Given this incredibly dire picture painted by the source, it offers specific advice to the listener on how to respond.
It provides 3 clear pieces of advice. Distrust the government, as it views governments as complicit in the alleged conspiracy.
Okay.
Avoid mass media, as it accuses media organizations of suppressing the truth.
Right.
And fight the lies, urging active resistance to the narrative it claims is false.
And the source suggests where listeners can find more information directly from the author, separate from the mass media it distrusts.
It directs listeners to visit the author's website, www.vernoncoleman.com, noting that it is free to access and contains no adverts or sponsors. The source also adds a cautionary note, claiming that the website is often blocked and hidden, and advises persistence if access is difficult, framing the difficulty in accessing the information as further evidence of the alleged suppression.
Okay. That was certainly an in-depth, deep dive into a source text presenting a profoundly challenging and disturbing view of current world events. We've covered the author's central claim of a global depopulation plan driven by a desire for world government control and financial savings. We've explored the alleged evidence presented by the source, from environmental and economic policies like net zero and the destruction of farming leading to death by cold and hunger, to the inclusion of mass immigration and spreading wars as parts of this plan.
And we spend considerable time detailing the source's most extensive argument, what it calls the end of medicine, claiming the medical establishment is deliberately moving from caring to killing through programs like the LCP, the alleged systematic abuse of DNR, claims of mass murder of the elderly during what the source calls the COVID fraud, and now the global promotion of euthanasia. The source presents this as a cold-blooded strategy to eliminate large segments of the population, particularly the vulnerable, for financial gain. And it provides specific examples and anecdotes to support these claims while portraying the widely accepted narrative of COVID as a hoax.
And the source's final, chilling warning to you, the listener, is that this vast plan it describes is real and that you are directly in its crosshairs, urging you to distrust government and media and to fight what it calls the lies.
Based purely on the perspective of the source material we've explored today, a final thought to consider is the sheer scale of the alleged conspiracy described. A plan so vast it supposedly encompasses environmental policy, farming, global conflict, and the fundamental nature of medical care, all aimed at a dramatic reduction in the human population for specific, calculated ends.
Thanks for tuning into the Despicable Maine Deep Dive podcast. Remember, the United States has been hijacked. So soon, living in the United States will be theft of your life.